Hey guys, this is Patrick from STH, and today we're going to take a look at these things right here, which are perhaps the cheapest 8-port switches in their class. Now these are not your typical 1 gig Ethernet super cheap 1 gig switches that are made of plastic and totally junky. Oh no, these are basically ones I think are only made and sold mostly in China. You can find them on AliExpress, but we actually have an 8-port 2.5 gig Ethernet switch as well as an 8-port SFP Plus switch. Now these prices definitely changed quite a bit, and I can't really help that. But this top switch, which is the 2.5 gig Ethernet one, that one is only $119 with free shipping, by the way. And the bottom one, well, that one's a little bit more at $166, which basically make these perhaps the cheapest switches in their class. In fact, for 10 gig Ethernet, a $20 a port switch is pretty darn good. And also on the 2.5 gig Ethernet, well, I guess it's a little bit more, but it's also like significantly less than what we saw the last time we looked at the, 8-port 2.5 gig Ethernet switch. I mean, this is like $50 or more less than what we saw previously. So this is actually very inexpensive. Now, before we get too far in this, there are definitely some catches. Other than the fact that you have to get these basically on AliExpress, and that these prices that I just quoted you are about $20 higher than if you're in, a domestic China market. I guess maybe that's shipping or whatever it is. The biggest one is the fact that these are not managed switches. These are unmanaged, just dumb switches. There are managed versions of some of these, but they cost a lot more. And also, they took a long time to get here. So just want to get all that out there. And in fact, by the end of this video, I want to let you know that I am not going to end up recommending this 2.5 gig Ethernet switch. The 10 gig switch I think is a little bit better, but I think that there's a better option that we actually have found for the 2.5 gig one. But I still want to just kind of show you because availability sucks, and that's just kind of where we are these days on switches. And so these are some options that we found, we tried them, and definitely had some findings in terms of things working and not working. And so let's get to it. And hey, as we're going through these, if you do like something, see something that's weird, if you've actually used them, feel free to comment below because there's just not a lot on these things, and we're trying to do our best to get some information on them out there. We're also gonna have chapter markers because you may be interested in like the 2.5 gig switch or the 10 gig switch, but I wanted to combine this review because I figured these things are super similar, and also I didn't want to do 2 videos on these, just frankly guys, it's just not enough. So if you want to skip ahead or just look at something specifically, we're gonna go and put those timestamps so you can go and kind of look through. Okay, but first, let's take a look at the hardware of these switches, and let's just start talking. Let's go to the 2.5 gig version first, and you're gonna look at the front of the switch. There's a power LED, and it says TP-Link. You also see the model number, which is the TL-SH1008. On the side of the switch, there are vents. The top of the switch says TP-Link. The bottom of the switch has a label and some rubber feet. On the back of the switch, we have pretty much all of the major features. There are a total of 8 RJ45 ports, which are 2.5 gig Ethernet. They can also negotiate down to 1 gigabit Ethernet speed, so you can run either one. So of course, if you have a device or two that are still running at 1 gig, or maybe you just want to you have half your network and you want to grow or something like that, you can do that in this switch, and that's kind of nice. We're gonna talk about negotiation a little bit later though. There's also a DC power input, which is 12 volt, 1.5 amps, and that matches the little TP-Link power supply that we get over here. Looking inside the switch, well, we basically get a pretty basic layout. There's really not like an extra management process or anything like that. We just basically get a switch chip and then the ports and all the circuitry that we need for that and delivering power. So that's actually not too big of a deal, but just kind of want to show you what's inside. The other thing I will mention is that this is a metal case. Now, a lot of the kind of lower end units, they are definitely plastic in the network switches, and this is actually a metal case, which I like. It probably adds another couple dollars and actually feels pretty solid and pretty heavy in hand. It's definitely nothing like a giant chassis switch. I think the next big switch we're going to look at is a Facebook Wedge 100, which is a 32-port 100 gig switch. Definitely nowhere near that. And we didn't do a video of it, but we reviewed on the main site. We actually did a 32-port 100 gig fiber store switch, so we just did that one. Again, that one definitely way more substantial. I mean, just the management processor is like about the size of this thing, but at the same time, it's a cheap switch. So for 120 bucks, that's what you get. Now, there is one thing that I really want to get to, and that's just what happens in terms of auto negotiation. Now, this switch can run at 1 gigabit and can also run at 2.5 gigabit speeds. Cool. But one of the things that we saw, which was kind of weird, was that when we connected this switch to an Intel X550, which is a dual port 10G-base-T NIC, and that one is definitely supposed to support, and definitely does support 5 gigabits per second. It supports 2.5 gigabits per second, 1 gigabit per second. It supports all those speeds. Well, one of the things that we saw with this, which was a little different, was that it was not auto negotiating properly. We would see, the thing go at like connect at like 2, but then it would drop to like 1, and then it would just drop the connection. And so what we ended up doing, and it worked, was we ended up going in and saying, this is a 2.5 gig and actually manually setting it to 2.5 gig. And that worked, but auto negotiation wise, it was not working. So that was kind of a weird thing. I don't really know what the answer is. And that's a really actually pretty modern, nice NIC. It's not like kind of a low end NIC. So I don't really know what to tell you on that, other than that was just kind of a weird behavior that we saw with this one. Now, the other switch that we have is the TL-SH1008F. And if you think, hey, are there very similar features to the 2.5 gig one? You are definitely correct. There's a power LED, and there's also the TP link and the model name. Now, a couple little things. One, yes, these actually are reversed compared to the 2.5 gig. I don't know why they couldn't put the power LED on the same side and just make things match, but if you're, very into those kind of things, you're not going to like this. Just want to point that out. And the other thing is that we got a random CE sticker on this, and I don't really know why this one had it, the other one didn't, and this is just kind of sitting there. I have no idea, but it's there, and so that's what we got. On the side of the switch, we have vents. On the top of the switch, it says TP link. On the bottom of the switch, we get a label. The one thing to note here is that this is version 1. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the fact is that this is the first version of the switch. There is a second, so a V2 version that has better support for things like 2.5 gig Ethernet. That was a total bummer when we actually found that out after we got ours. But there are people on the STH forums, so if you go, those are always linked in the description, but they've actually taken this, and we'll link to the specific article where they've actually taken these things apart and shown the differences between the V1 and V2. We didn't get to pick which one we got. This is just one we got, and we got it about the same time frame, and so I don't really know why, but we just did get this one. And I don't know how to tell you to get to a V2 instead, but I think the V2 is actually better than this one, but this is the one that we have. So the other feature that we have is the 12 volt 2 amp DC power input, and then we have a little AC adapter that is a little bit different than the other one, because the other one was a 1.5 amp. This is a 2 amp. And when we get to power consumption, you're actually going to see the reason that that's important, because these can use pretty close to these rated power supplies. Now inside the switch, you can see that we have SFP cages, kind of as we would expect. There's no real management processor like we would expect on a higher end, managed switch. And then the main switch chip is basically buried under this just giant or relatively large heatsink. Now, one thing that we didn't do is we didn't pull this off because I needed to actually just kind of show you guys this demo. But if you do want to actually go look what's underneath, you can look on the STH forums. Again, this thread has the look of what's underneath this. There's actually a Realtek switch chip in here. And frankly, that's not necessarily like the best, but this is a pretty darn low end switch. I mean, you're not going to have like a Broadcom Tomahawk or something like that in here, because we're just, these are low-end switches, but they're cheap, and that's why people sometimes use them in very cheap devices like this. I will say, though, that this thing generally worked okay. So I wouldn't say that it was necessarily bad, but again, this is a simple, unmanaged, and relatively low performance. It's 80 gigabit per second switch at this point, and that's less than one of the ports on my main workstation that's now 100 gig. So this is not like really high-end networking these days. Now, in terms of the SFP Plus model, frankly, this is a pretty nice unit, but on the other hand, we did see some things that were a little bit challenging. For example, I used a number of 25 gig Ethernet SFP, just, optics that we had just laying around the lab. And I would say that our pass rate on this was probably like 50-60% actually negotiated down to 10 gig properly. But, frankly, if you're using a cheap switch like this, you're probably not using 25 gig optics, you're probably using 10 gig optics. It's just we've actually been converting most of the ones that we used to 25 gigs, so that's what we had. But the key lesson there is that you do want to use SFP Plus, not SFP28 in terms of your optics for this thing. But overall, the SFP Plus compatibility was really good. There's no vendor locking or anything like that, because this is a cheap switch. So you don't necessarily get those things that kind of gotchas on really high-end brands. Of course, this is definitely not a high-end switch. Just want to make sure everybody's out there, so we're all clear on that. But at the same time, this thing actually worked okay. Although the one thing it definitely did not do was it did not like negotiating to things like 5 gigabit per second, like multi-gig speeds, like that. This thing is not the right switch for that. So just as something to keep in mind. What we did not have, though, this is the V1 switch. This is not the V2 switch. And if you go look at the forum post, there's actually the V2 switch, and people have tested it and said hey, that actually works with 2.5 gig Ethernet, whereas the V1 switch didn't. But I just bought this one and I got the V1, so that's what it is, and it's kind of AliExpress, so you never know what you're gonna get. Still, the benefit to these two units, as you noticed when we went inside, was the fact that these are fanless, so there's no noise, and I didn't really hear any perceptible coil whine or anything like that, even in relatively quiet environments. I just really wasn't, even with my ear right next to me, I wasn't really hearing that. Now, of course, these things are cheap switches, so there are definitely manufacturing variations that you'd expect. So I don't necessarily know what every switch is going to be like, but just telling you guys that in these, actually, they were silent for me, which I think is an absolutely great feature. With that, let's get to performance. Now, in terms of overall performance, we just kind of basically did a pretty simple test. Because these are unmanaged switches, we just basically just blasted iPerf 3 across different pairs and just kind of did bidirectional. And we actually saw that we were able to go and hit our 2.5 gig speeds on the 2.5 gig switch and also the 10 gig speeds on the 10 gig switch, which isn't really anything that, you know, you would think is kind of weird or anything like that. But we did just verify the fact that we were getting around line rate, even, you know, totally loading these things up. And also the fact that, you know, we ran these things for like an hour and they didn't crash, even fully loaded. You're never going to run them at that workload rating, right? I mean, these things are never going to be 100% just flat out nonstop like a benchmark. But on the other hand, they did stay up and they didn't fail or anything like that. So I thought that was, you know, at least reasonably good. Now, one of the biggest questions we get is in terms of power consumption. I mean, how much power do these things use? Is it a lot more than the 1 gigabit Ethernet switches as an example? And the answer is, well, yeah, they definitely do. Now, this is an X-Tech True RMS power meter, and we're gonna see on the far side, the far LCD over there, you're gonna see the power consumption. Now we're at a little over 118 volts on this this config, so it's more kind of like a North American setup or something like that. And then behind me, what I have is 2 of the 4-port 2.5 gig Ethernet, just kind of little router firewall boxes that we've reviewed recently. And those each have 1 NIC that's going to our infrastructure, but that means that we still have 3 NICs each. So I get 6 cables here to go play with. And just, these are all 2.5 gig Ethernet. So I figured, well, that's kind of something cool to kind of show you what the power consumption is just plugging things in. Now, what you're gonna see here is that we're at 4.5 watts. You can see that we are totally at idle with nothing plugged in other than the TP-Link adapter to the switch. Now let's start putting, you know, some of these in. And so we're gonna put in, you know, 1 in port 1. And now if you go look over there, you're gonna see that we add a little bit of power. We're now up at about 5.7 watts. And as we just, I'll just kind of continue plugging these things in so you guys can kind of see just kind of, you know, what this looks like. And hopefully it's in focus enough that you can actually see it. But as we kind of go and plug these things in, what you're gonna see is, so now we have 6 of these just plugged in, just as an example. And with these 6 plugged in, you're gonna see that we're sitting at a little over 11 watts. So we've gone from, you know, call about 4.4, 4.5 watts up to about 11.1 watts with 6 of these in there. So while we never saw more than like 16 watts when we were testing this, at the same time, even with all 8 ports going and stuff like that, at the same time, you know, this is just not a super high power unit. It's not necessarily as low power as some of the 1 gig units, but this just kind of shows you in terms of, you know, how much power consumption you could expect. Okay, now let's get a little bit wild, and we're gonna do something a little bit different with this 10 gig module, just because of what I have set up behind me. So we just plugged it in, and you're gonna notice that this is at about 3.1 watts or so. Okay, so what I did was I threw in 3 SFP Plus to RJ45 10 gigabit Ethernet adapters. And these are 3 different brands. I think there's a MikroTik, a WeTech, and then also a Ubiquiti one. And they all, you know, are you can see that we have the link lights there. But the big question is, will this accept our 2.5 gig Ethernet connections by plugging it in here? Let's go plug in these and see what we get. Now, these 3 are actually only connected at 1 gigabit per second speeds, and there's really no indication on there just to kind of show that. But I just kind of thought it was interesting that even with that, and then going through the relatively inefficient path, which is going SFP Plus to RJ45, which uses usually more power than actually the optical modules, what you can see here is that we've gone up to 10.2 watts. Okay, so now we have 6 of these plugged in, and something's kind of interesting here. So first thing you're gonna notice over here is that even though we have 6 of these plugged in, and initially all of them were working, we did see an issue on port 7, which is why this little LED light is not on. Hopefully you guys can see that. We're also now up to 18.2 watts. Now, if you're using like short range optics or things like that, you really won't ever get to like this level of power consumption. This is really because we are using these modules that are going from SFP to RJ45. But at the same time, I just kind of wanted to kind of show you a not necessarily great case. Okay, now what I've done is I've replaced the Ubiquiti RJ45 SFP Plus modules with another brand, so that way they actually work. So you can see that we now have number 7 actually has a LED status light, so that's actually working. That's pretty awesome. And then the other thing you're gonna see is that I added 2 long range. These are actually 10 kilometer. We definitely don't have 10 kilometers of fiber here, but we did put in the, you know, kind of longer range 10 kilometer SFP Plus optics. You can see that those are working, and that, you know, the power consumption is actually a lot higher. Right now we're at about 22 watts. So I think that the thing that we've learned from this is that you can definitely, with this one, get darn close to that 24 watts. I mean, we're not even really passing that much traffic through this. The LED status for activity is not great on these, actually. Like, they're not blinking. But anyway, we're not really passing that much traffic through them. I think these things are used at like 25% or so. And still, even with that, we're at about 22 watts of power consumption. With shorter range optics, a lot of times we were more in like the 17 to 18 watt range. And so overall, I think that, it does matter what kind of pluggables you use, if you're using DACs or if you're using other modules. So it totally matters what you're using in terms of power consumption. But at least I hope that this kind of gives you some demonstration of what that looks like in terms of scaling. I don't know if this is useful, but let me know in the comments if you think it is. It's not perfect, sure, I know, but I thought maybe this is kind of an interesting way to show you versus just telling you the power consumption numbers. All right, so these are cheap switches and they are a little bit funky, but would I buy them again if I was not just doing a YouTube review? Well, let's talk about that in a couple different ways. First off, this 2.5 gig model, I probably would not purchase at $120. I think that's a little too high. If it was $99, I would say, heck yeah, this thing is awesome. But at $120, it comes too close to another one that we're gonna be doing a review of soon. And frankly, this is not what I would do. Now, this one is more expensive, but it's also way better than this one. So I would say stay tuned. But frankly, if you just want the cheapest 8-port, 2.5 gig Ethernet switch that we can find these days, I think this is it. Okay, now let's talk about the 10 gig model because I think that's a little bit different to me. This was $166, which is frankly pretty darn cheap. I mean, I don't really know how to say that other than the fact that it is cheap. Now, you don't get any great features. It's literally an unmanaged switch, and so you basically can plug things in. They have connectivity to one another, but you don't get any of the kind of like nice features that you kind of want, especially as you start to get to higher speed network. Frankly, I think that the MikroTik CRS-309 that we did a review of, I think 2019 or something like that, I think that that one is frankly a much better option, and I probably will be totally ashamed of watching that video again, but I'll link to the main site article. Now, that MikroTik one, when it was selling for about $230 street price, just to me, that was a better deal. It was like I think it was like $270 as a list price, but the street was like $230. I think that that was a really good deal. And frankly, it's like $60 more, but that's less than $10 a port more. And frankly, just having those extra features, like having the management features and the, stuff that MikroTik does, I think is actually a little bit better. And so I would say that if the difference is in that like $55 to $60 range, personally, I would actually go spend the extra money for the MikroTik versus this, because I just like having the extra features, because it's always that like one day that you're just like, man, I wish this was actually a managed switch, not just a dumb switch. At the same time though, there are definitely people that just want like, what is the cheapest SFP plus 10 gigabit per second switch that I could possibly get? And that's definitely this one. At only $166, this thing is basically $20, $21 a port, which is absolutely great. But I do want to just point out that that is not necessarily the cost of a SFP plus switch, because you have to remember that you are going to have to go and populate this thing. So even if you were to go get DACs and you get super cheap DACs, like let's say you got $10, $15, $20 DACs, I don't know what eBay pricing is, but if you just kind of randomly went out there and had the direct attached copper, so you weren't even using like the optics or anything like that, you're still probably talking about this being another $80 to $100 minimum to go and populate. Now, the plus side is, especially if you live in Europe or somewhere else that has very high power costs, is the fact that the SFP plus networking tends to use less power than if you have 10G base T by a pretty significant amount. So even though you are spending more upfront, you're going to kind of make that back in terms of kind of ongoing costs. But overall, I think the thing that we definitely learned is that these switches are pretty darn inexpensive, and they're also not available on things like Amazon. So while I don't necessarily think that either of these switches are by far the best switches I've ever used or anything like that, and in fact, I probably don't even trust them necessarily as much as just a cheapo 5-port Netgear switch that's like stuck in a wall somewhere that everybody forgets about, or 8-port switch that nobody even remembers is there, but it's just been left forever, and just everybody has a story like that. These I don't really kind of feel the same way. I kind of feel like I'm a little bit more nervous about them. And the other thing is that there are pretty telling things, like TP-Link does sell things on places like Amazon, but you're not going to find these switches. We just checked right now as I'm recording this video. You're not going to find these things on Amazon. They're missing things like, UL certifications and a lot of the things that you would kind of hope to see on a switch or an electronic device that's being sold in the US. So, I mean, overall, I guess the answer is that these things are cheap. And if you absolutely need to save as much money as possible, then I guess this is your option. But at the low end of the market, there are definitely a ton of options out there. So I would say definitely take a peruse around and see what's available available, when it's available. Supply chain for switches just as a category is just horrid right now. And so, maybe this is the best thing that you can get and you don't really care about those kind of safety certifications. And hey, I hope you enjoyed this video looking at some of the cheapest 8-port just kind of switch options that we could find. They're definitely interesting. I had no idea what these things look like. There's just nothing on them. So I figured, hey, let's go get them and just kind of show you guys what's there. We definitely have some better options in terms of 2.5 gig and also even just up to 100 gig switches that we're going to be doing. So definitely stay tuned for that. We have a lot of networking content coming. And if you did like this video, well, why don't you give it a like, click subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you can see whenever we come out with great new videos. As always, thanks for watching. Have an awesome day.